on the Szabonian Metaphorical Framework for objectively traversing the complex history of mankind. Now that we are considering thought systems as inputs for Turing machines, we can build an objective, metaphorized framework that allows us to deconstruct the history of mankind in a Szabonian useful fashion, on the unprovability and inconsistency of the occult. This kind of framework was built once before by a lady named Helena Blavatsky. Helena's work has been buried under the Nazi construction. Science abhors her and her work, but she taught us Szabonian deconstruction by another name, esotericism. Helena claims she was indoctrined by the East and brought hidden truths back to the West. Her truths were unprovable and inconsistent. All thought systems have this form. Helena taught us to reference sources and to consider horizontal, transient, or vertical, traditional, distance in this regard. On the symbols of the occult and the East. It was the occult that had revised a new understanding of the nature of the swastika. The swastika we know because of the occult was a symbol of life. It is now a forbidden symbol in our culture, as it is forbidden to call ourselves Nazis. On Godwin's law as a hidden axiom. We have a theory called Godwin's law that every argument boils down to you take Hitler's side. Online, where Sybil accounts rule the ratio, Godwin's law rules all the available forums for dialogue. Part 1. On metaphors that have horizontal, transient, distance complexity from present-day circumstances. On the relevant animal metaphors of history. Isn't it interesting when we consider different complex human institutions as represented sometimes by their likeness to animals? No doubt humans have been internalizing and worshipping the greatest beasts of nature since before they could symbolize them. The great eagle of America, for example, symbolizes patriotism and freedom to so many. On monetary policy and the ability to signal and strategize with it from a hermeneutic perspective. Within the system of the great eagle, there is the concept of the dove and the hawk with respect to the direction of monetary policy of the US dollar. From a hermeneutic perspective, we can think of Nash's observation of Newton's signal of the gold standard and the relevance of the king. Quote, its value pegged to gold in 1717 by Isaac Newton, who was then master of the mint. Of course, it was not irrelevant that George II, the king then, was an early Hanoverian, and also ruled territories in Germany, end quote. On games and their comparison to metaphors. Quote, an interesting book on game theory, Negotiation Games, by Stephen Brams, reinterprets several Torah, Old Testament stories as games between the characters in the stories. Quote by Szabo. From our Szabonian deconstruction toolset, we are reminded to compare the concept of hawk and dove in the U.S. financial system to the game of hawk-dove. We should keep this kind of comparison in mind when we attempt to tease out the nature of complex intersubjective truths. On Keynes and animal metaphors. Of such metaphors, Keynes is famous for saying, quote, most, probably, of our decisions to do something positive, the full consequences of which will be drawn out over many days to come, can only be taken as the result of animal spirits, a spontaneous urge to action rather than inaction, and not as the outcome of a weighted average of quantitative benefits multiplied by quantitative probabilities. It was Nash that noted also, quote, and indeed a very famous saying of Keynes was, in the long run we will all be dead. On the bull and the bear as economic forces. Everyone knows that they are up when the bull is good and down when the bear is good. Part 2. On the metaphors that have vertical, traditional, distance complexity from present-day circumstances. On the framework of metaphors for traversing traditional distance complexity. Quote, intersubjective truths can be classified into at least two major groups, transient, proximate, between contemporaries, and traditional, ultimate, or multi-generational. Szabo. What kind of metaphors are useful for traversing traditional distance complexity? On the destruction of text as a natural implementation of an axiom of self-consistency. Many of the historically metaphorical texts were destroyed throughout history Destroying inconsistent truths is one technique for preserving an otherwise inconsistent system. We shouldn't then expect to find such actions explained and recorded as such. However, upon the archaeological discovery of the destruction of a truth, we can look for both the implication of the inconsistency it represents in the attacking civilization system, as well as how the attacking civilization explained how they made the inconsistent natural truth disappear naturally. On Plato's account of the historical truth and other similar matching metaphorical stories. All religious stories seem to talk about a great flood, and Plato wrote in great detail of Atlantis. Many great cities are thought to have been lost as the ocean plays a special role in human population growth. On the specialness of culturally significant places. We have already noted in our argument the concept of economic capacitance, in which we instill into otherwise inanimate objects or phenomenon cultural power through our individual internal axioms and their cooperative alignment with the object in question. Different religious sites are examples, such as Mecca and the Holy Sepulchre. These are pilgrimage sites every devotee must, in their heart at least, defend and enter into. On superstition and nature. There is a phenomenon, the Bermuda Triangle, where planes and ships were said to enter and never come back. It was Smith that noted of persons that had felt as if, in their presence of ghosts, when recreationally occupying a notable relic of great and past architecture. We will look for the citation later. He notes, this arises from the spookiness of not understanding how giants could have built such marvels. Note, some year or more later I found the passage from Tom's. Quote, noble palaces, magnificent villas, great collections of books, statues, pictures, and curiosities of architecture and of the arts are the amusements of the rich. In the ruins of ancient magnificence, in the remains of ancient architecture, we feel a reverence for the great antiquity of the works, and are disposed to bestow upon them a sort of veneration, beyond what is due to the merit of the work itself. The reverence which we feel for them seems to arise from the thought of the great and noble persons who once inhabited them, or from the idea of the greatness of power and the greatness of the wealth which could erect such monuments. Adam Smith, Theory of Moral Sentiments. It seems we ascribe to such phenomenon as being the concept of superstition. Nick Szabo on Dead Reckoning and the Mystery of the Exploration Explosion. We can think of Nick Szabo's observations on Dead Reckoning to help us navigate complex intersubjective truths. Szabo's inquiry was such that he was trying to understand how the sea voyage explosion occurred when it did. Quote, I also hope to someday figure out just why the exploration explosion occurred when it did. End quote. He talks about the advents of different relevant technologies in different cultures with respect to their advantages. Quote, the advent of rigorous dead reckoning, combining the compass, the sandglass, and decent estimates of speed with rigorous log keeping, did not occur in Asia, where the Chinese, lacking the sandglass at least, made a less systematic use of the compass, nor with the Arabs, who seldom used either sandglass or compass, which along with naval superiority explains why the exploration explosion occurred from Western Europe. End quote. And yet, quote, the puzzle of why the explosion started specifically in the 1480s and not sooner or later, however, remains a mystery to be solved. End quote. On the greatest triumphs of mankind and their useful metaphors. Wasn't it a Cold War that started the space race in which the Americans proved, via television broadcasts and photographs of their flag waving on the moon, that they had indeed stepped foot on it? And notice the metaphor declares it as so. Quote, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. End quote. This was a significantly economically valuable achievement for the United States, history tells us. What kind of Szabonian deconstructions might this imply? On useful metaphorization of the division and specialization of labor. Milton Friedman explains how technology is an artifact on the effects of the division and specialization of labor.
The basic principles underlying the free market, as Adam Smith taught them to his students in this university, are really very simple. Look at this lead pencil. There's not a single person in the world who could make this pencil. Remarkable statement? Not at all. The wood from which it's made, for all I know, comes from a tree that was cut down in the state of Washington. To cut down that tree, it took a saw. To make the saw, it took steel. To make the steel, it took iron ore. This black center, we call it lead, but it's really graphite, compressed graphite. I'm not sure where it comes from, but I think it comes from some mines in South America. This red top up here, the eraser, bit of rubber, probably comes from Malaya, where the rubber tree isn't even native. It was imported from South America by some businessmen with the help of the British government. This brass ferrule, I haven't the slightest idea where it came from, or the yellow paint, or the paint that made the black lines, or the glue that holds it together. Literally thousands of people cooperated to make this pencil. People who don't speak the same language, who practice different religions, who might hate one another if they ever met. When you go down to the store and buy this pencil, you are in effect trading a few minutes of your time for a few seconds of the time of all those thousands of people. What brought them together and induced them to cooperate to make this pencil? There was no commissar sending out orders from some central office. It was a magic of the price system, the impersonal operation of prices that brought them together and got them to cooperate to make this pencil so that you could have it for a trifling sum. That is why the operation of the free market is so essential, not only to promote productive efficiency, but even more, to foster harmony and peace among the peoples of the world.
Friedman means to say it is from Smith we learn the ultimate force from which humans can derive technology from nature. Smith is the great Hermeneutic philosopher. Quote, to take an example, therefore, from a trifling manufacture, but one in which the division of labor has been very often taken notice of, the trade of the pin maker, a workman not educated to this business, which the division of labor has rendered a distinct trade, nor acquainted with the use of the machinery employed in it, to the invention of which the same division of labor has probably given occasion, could scarce, perhaps, with his utmost industry, make 1 pin in a day, and certainly could not make 20. But in the way in which this business is now carried on, not only the whole work is a peculiar trade, but it is divided into a number of branches, of which the greater part are likewise peculiar trades. One man draws out the wire, another straights it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. To make the head requires 2 or 3 distinct operations. To put it on is a peculiar business. To whiten the pins is another. It is even a trade by itself to put them into the paper, and the important business of making the pins is in this manner divided into about 18 distinct operations, which, in some manufactories, are all performed by distinct hands. Throughout, in others, the same man will sometimes perform 2 or 3 of them. I have seen a small manufactory of this kind where 10 men only were employed, and where some of them consequently performed 2 or 3 distinct operations. But though they were very poor, and therefore indifferently accommodated with the necessary machinery, they could, when they exerted themselves, make among them about 12 pounds of pins in a day. There are in a pound upwards of 4,000 pins of a middling size. Those 10 persons, therefore, could make among them upwards of 48,000 pins a day. Each person, therefore, making a 10th part of 48,000 pins might be considered as making 4,800 pins in a day. But if they had all wrought separately and independently, and without any of them having been educated to this peculiar business, they certainly could not each of them have made 20. Perhaps not 1 pin in a day, that is certainly not the 240th, perhaps not the 4,800th part of what they are at present capable of performing in consequence of a proper division and combination of their different operations. Technological advances as consequences of thought experiments and the limitations of reason. Bitcoin and the nuclear bomb are examples of technology that exists primarily because of the philosophy and ability of man to reason. However, it is a hermeneutic truth to understand that it is nature from which we derive and evolve our reason. Helena taught us this. She also said horses are from the Americas. On the discovery of Einstein's equations and his claim of God. Einstein famously said of God, now the internet is full of fake Einstein quotes, but I believe he said something along this lines. Quote, God does not play dice with the universe, end quote. This was an exclamation of how he expected to find that reality worked. Nash famously went to Einstein about a theory on light. It was said Einstein gave him some books to read. On Nash and unbreakable encryption. We noted in a previous essay that Nash wrote to the NSA of his unbreakable encryption conjecture idea. Of this observation, Nash wrote, quote, since the U.S. presumably does not want other nations to use ciphers we cannot expect to break, this general principle should probably be studied but kept secret, end quote. Szabo on randomness and its relevance to Szabonian deconstruction. Szabo explains of the relevant points of absolute compression and true randomness. Quote, empirically, it seems likely that generating truly random numbers is much more practical than absolute compression. If one has access to certain well-observed physical phenomenon, one can make highly confident, if still mathematically unproven, assumptions of true randomness. But said phenomenon don't help with absolute compression. End quote. On Bitcoin as a cryptographic moon money. It is interesting the religious metaphors and tropes Bitcoin has already accumulated. There is much room for Szabonian deconstruction because of the speed and complexity of the evolution of the project. An interesting equation with no context or framework. In Nash's last lecture, he talked of an interesting equation he had derived as a generalization of Einstein's work. In the lecture, he expresses, quote, but I don't myself understand either renormalization or the general theory of quantization. To me, it seems like quantum theory is in a sense like a traditional herbal medicine used by witch doctors. We don't really understand what is happening, what the ultimate truth really is, but we have a cookbook of procedures and rituals that can be used to obtain useful and practical calculations, independent of fundamental truth.